Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I know, COVID, whatever. So it's come to my attention that I've sort of been pigeonholed, you could say, into a certain position on LRT. I'm not really sure why. Anyways, before I get into this video, I want to talk about kind of a general consideration I think that we should all try to have as transit advocates or people who often will get into debates about transit, because if you care about transit, you're often probably going to find yourself debating it. What I want you to consider is that human beings are complex. We have complex feelings and thoughts, and just because someone thinks one thing doesn't necessarily mean they're going to think something else. And so, despite the fact that I make a lot of videos where I'm critical of LRT projects, you should not infer from that that I don't think any LRT projects make sense. I get how it's easy to kind of simplify and strawman and treat people like they're kind of foils, but at the end of the day, when it comes to transit, there are a wide range of technologies, and some of them make sense in various different places, and there's a reason most of them exist. I don't think there's truly a single technology that exists for no purpose. Well, Hyperloop exists. Anyways, today's video is really about light rail, LRT. I don't like that term, and the reason I don't like it is because it leads to confusion. As a transit advocate, you should be concerned that there's this technology name that doesn't really have a lot of meaning. It could mean a variety of different things, and when we use a term like LRT, we confuse people who we may be trying to advocate for. So what I'm going to try to do in this video is talk about light rail or trams, or kind of whatever I think best describes the system. I might talk about a specific implementation of LRT, but I'm going to try to avoid using that term. I know I committed to not using it, and it's just really rooted in our discourse, and I think that's problematic because, again, it's just not a good term. Even people who understand transit struggle to understand what one person is talking about versus another when they're talking about LRT, because this is LRT, and also this is LRT, and apparently in some places this is LRT. So my first example of a light rail system that I really like is Calgary's system. It's a system I've talked about a lot before, and Calgary's system is a really great representation of what you could do with light rail when you do it right. Now, Calgary's light rail system extensively uses boom gates, essentially those gates that come down in front of railroad crossings that, blink and make sound, to essentially give the LRT system a fully dedicated right-of-way. Now, it's not grade separated, which means that it's still possible for cars to get in the way of trains, which means that this system isn't perfectly reliable, but in areas where congestion isn't a super huge problem, boom gates can be a great way to get a fully grade separated experience. You have that dedicated right-of-way, trains don't have to stop for cars, without the cost of having grade separations everywhere. And this type of approach makes sense, especially in low-density areas. Now, to be clear, I'm often for grade separation in places like Toronto because they're dense urban environments with a lot of congestion and traffic. But in a place like suburban Calgary, or in a lot of regional rail applications, I think that boom gates are fine. And if it allows you to get the cost of transit down, well, that's great because it means you can expand more drastically, which is part of why Calgary has such an extensive system despite being not that big of a city. Of course, riding Calgary's system, what you also immediately notice is that it's quite fast. It's not metro fast, but it gets around quite quickly, and that's because, again, it has such high priority. This is something to think about a lot when we're talking about light rail. What helps the system even more in Calgary is that the trains are high floor, which means you have that flat floor experience, and the trains are quite accessible, and frankly, when you're sitting inside of it, it feels like a subway, and I think that most people would probably refer to it as a subway if it was running in a tunnel. Now, to be clear, high-floor light rail is not all that common. Calgary and Edmonton systems, which were among the first in North America, are derived from systems in Germany like the Frankfurt U-Bahn. What's important to note is that high floor just isn't that common though. LA has it, St. Louis has it, but on the whole it's not that common, and I think that's a bit of a mistake. If we're looking for a regional rail style of LRT, then I think that these high floor trains make a lot of sense. Which is why I often characterize these sort of light rail systems as being S-Bahn-like, because they travel in corridors and they operate in ways that look like S-Bahns. Now, to be clear, Calgary had some help with its light rail system, and that's part of what makes it a little bit of a special case. Calgary was able to expand an existing freight right-of-way for its south line, and other portions of its network were built on areas that were kind of pre-allocated for light rail. So essentially, if you didn't pre-plan in the space to lay down the tracks and put the stations, etc., the system probably would have costed a lot more. You can see this by comparing the Northeast Line to the West Line. The West Line basically had to cut its own path through the city, and while it's a great line, seriously, the Calgary West LRT is one of my favorite transit lines in North America, it's certainly quite expensive, which means it's going to be hard to replicate in a lot of places. Another great element of Calgary's LRT is that traffic and trains don't really mix. The closest they come is in the downtown transit mall, but even there it is a downtown transit mall, and so car traffic isn't technically allowed. The separation of cars from trains means more reliability and less of a risk to both drivers, pedestrians, and passengers, which I think is really important for when we're talking about a transit system. It should be focused and oriented around high-quality transit service first, not around signal timings and how can we not impact car drivers the most. For Calgary, the benefit of LRT was being able to create a wide regional electrified rail network using pre-existing corridors in a way that probably wouldn't be feasible with regional rail. At least it wouldn't have been back when Calgary created its system. Now, another great case study for light rail is ION in Waterloo Region, which I frankly talk about a lot on this channel. Waterloo Region is not giant. It's around 500,000 people. And ION was built quite inexpensively, around $1 billion Canadian dollars if I recall correctly. It's been open for a few years now, but it's just truly a very impressive system for such a small region. It's also worth noting that for Waterloo's application, the trains are pretty nice. I wouldn't call the system mass transit because it's using single unit trams compared to Eglinton Crosstown in Toronto, which is meant to operate at really high frequencies with multi-car trains. So the limited number of doors that we see on the trains in Waterloo, again the same ones that are going to be used in Toronto, are less of a big deal in that case. Now, to be clear, Waterloo Region's ION is not perfect. It's slow, and I've had friends who've moved from Vancouver to Waterloo for school mention to me how slow it is compared to, say, the SkyTrain. In fact, it's so slow that sometimes it's faster to take a bus. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that light rail never makes sense. Again, it has its flaws, and it has its upsides. It's just important to weigh these things. I actually used to be a huge LRT advocate back in Metro Vancouver, before I was sort of converted by the SkyTrain enthusiasts of Metro Vancouver. But when I was still a light rail enthusiast, I definitely thought a lot about what are the benefits of light rail. And it is true that over a bus you get a higher ride quality, more consistency, and it's true that people probably prefer riding a rail vehicle to a bus. Now, getting back to ION, another reason that light rail made a lot of sense there is because you have a sort of mixed operating environment. What I mean by this is you have some sections on rail corridors and some sections on kind of small urban streets. And what light rail does really well in this case is act flexibly. You can get up to full speed along the rail corridors, and then you can sort of slow down and weave through dense urban areas. It kind of creates a hybrid sort of system that's pretty attractive and can be quite convenient, and it goes quite fast when it's on a rail corridor. Another thing that's worth pointing out, I complain a lot about low-floor trams. But again, in a system like Waterloo, where capacity isn't a huge consideration and where the point is mainly to provide a kind of high-quality electrified transit, low-floor trams make a lot of sense, because what it means is that building stations is incredibly inexpensive because, again, you're basically just creating a curb, and you still get the benefits of level boarding. And, of course, I'm never going to deny the fact that when you're boarding off a curb or from the street, having a low-floor vehicle is great, because you can basically go up a slight ramp and then you can step straight into the train. There's no big, long ramp that creates accessibility issues, etc., that you see in places like Los Angeles. For Waterloo Region, the benefit of LRT was the flexibility which allowed it to operate in urban environments in some places and on rail corridors in others. This flexibility allowed a region that isn't all that big and didn't have a ton of money to create an incredibly high-quality transit system for the price. I want to kind of diverge and talk a bit about why I complain about light rail in Toronto. While it is true that I often think that light rail isn't the right technology for us to be using, part of it is also because I don't think we get the best version of light rail in Toronto. It's funny because you should be able to criticize something without necessarily being opposed to it. When I'm criticizing light rail, I think often if my criticisms were taken seriously, not saying they will be, then we could create a better light rail system that would actually be more convincing and would actually bring more advocates into the fold for supporting it. One big benefit I see for light rail is the ability to kind of create a network and do interlining. Now, before you go saying that, hey, Transit City was going to be all about interlining and creating a network, that's not really what I'm talking about. You can have two light rail lines which are connected, but which don't interline in terms of service. And in Transit City's case, interlining just didn't make a ton of sense. It's cool to have interlining for operational reasons, and it's good for being able to shuttle vehicles and equipment around. But if you want to create an in-service interlining, well, a grid just isn't going to do it, because no one's going to want to ride from here across the city and then down. They'd rather transfer at the soonest possible point to travel south. Interlining is something you see in a ton of light rail systems because when the infrastructure is cheap to construct, it's easy to add a lot of branches as you travel further out in the city, which lets you capitalize on core sections of the line which may not be at full utilization with typical frequencies. It's interesting because if you look at light rail systems across North America, you'll notice that they're almost always interlined, and yet the system we were proposing for Transit City didn't really interline at all in terms of actual service. Again, connections between lines are different than service interlining. Some examples of this are Denver, or Calgary, or Portland. Another issue is low-floor trains. Well, I understand that low-floor trains make a lot of sense when you're operating in the middle of the street, because building giant stops with high platforms doesn't. When you're operating on a rail corridor, high platforms suddenly make a lot more sense. And I think that one of the mistakes we make in Toronto is always running trains down the middle of the street with our light rail lines. For the Finch West line, I think it would have been far better, for example, to use the Hydro Corridor just a few hundred meters north of the corridor we're using, which is on street. Not only would you probably enable higher speeds, but you could have probably made an argument for using high-floor trains, which are higher quality, in my personal opinion, than low-floor trains. Another important part of light rail is signal priority. Without it, you're kind of kneecapping your solution. Now, to be clear, light rail can operate without signal priority, but I think the political argument for putting in signal priority when you put in light rail is that you're building all this infrastructure, you're doing all this work, politicians that might not even be behind you otherwise, they get the benefit of a new transit project and they probably want to see it succeed, so it's a great time to implement signal priority right from the get-go. The fact that we won't have strong signal priority on the Eglinton Crosstown, Toronto's most important light rail line, kind of speaks to this. Now, to be clear, there are many grades of signal priority, and so it's important to mention that while we will have signal priority, in the ideal world, light rail trains never see a red light, and that's what's implemented in Calgary with their boom gates. Another thing that probably should be avoided, though I'll be fair, this isn't something we've seen a lot of in Toronto, but it is something we saw in Waterloo, are tight corners. Well, tight corners are something that light rail can definitely do. The problem with them is that it really slows things down. Part of the reason that Waterloo's ION system is quite slow in places is because it has to navigate a number of tight corners, often that it wouldn't necessarily have needed to had a better alignment been chosen. At the end of the day, this is the classic case of with great power comes great responsibility. Light rail is incredibly flexible, but because of this flexibility, there's also a lot of risk that we implement a suboptimal solution. For example, with light rail, you might have to fight with car-loving politicians about getting signal priority. This is something that just is not an issue with light metro, for example. I don't think we often enough consider this sort of political angle to our transit technologies in North America. Considering how a system will work in the real world is incredibly important. We often create idealized versions of transit systems in our minds, and sort of how we expect them to operate. And then when we get to the ground and we've actually built the system, we realize things just don't turn out that way. In my opinion, it might be better in some cases to consider this beforehand, so that we choose a technology which can kind of skirt around political issues. At the end of the day, what I hope I've illustrated with this video is that I'm not opposed to all light rail. There are some light rail systems that are great and that I enjoyed riding, and I wouldn't go visit all these systems if I didn't. I've also said, and I'll say it again, I'm excited for Toronto's new light rail lines. They're not optimal in my personal opinion, but more transit and more rail transit and more electrified transit is good for the city. There's no reason not to criticize lines, especially lines which have already been built, because we're stuck with them. The whole point of criticizing something which exists is to learn from it so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We have to all remember, it's incredible to live in a place like Toronto where transit is actually being built. Whether you like it or not, at the end of the day, the outcomes for transit users are better. The debates that we often have about light rail or automated light metro are more about how could we maximize the use of each dollar. At the end of the day, everyone is really on the same side. We all love transit and we all want to see the systems expand. I hope this video helped and clarified things, and at the end of the day, I still love you, light rail.